we can get started with a brief introduction. I'm Caitlin Coughlin. I'm the Executive Director at the Louisa County Historical Society. For those of you who have met me or seen me before, welcome again. And for those who are new to this, we are really excited to have you here. First, Marilyn Campbell, who's our Grant Program Manager for our African American History Program, will give a brief update on kind of where we are and what we're doing and events for this month, and then we'll roll into our presentation. So Marilyn, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, well, good morning, viewers, and thank you for joining the Louisa County Historical Society as we recognize April as Oral History Month. It is a time to share stories and memories and find those untold stories and unheard voices from our community. As Caitlin mentioned, I'm Marilyn Campbell, Grant Program Manager over the African American History Program. And the African American History Program is just one of several programs that the Society has. And last year, 2021, two programs specifically came into being with the Society, and that was their digitalization program to archive and digitize records and photographs that people have from the community, as well as the African American History Program. The African American History Program is grant funded, and the reason why it came into existence is because the society realized that they did not have full representation of the community, or many of the files were missing areas or decades of time. So it is our effort to outreach with three specific projects in mind. And that came under the advisement of a community group. A community advisory council was formed to guide three main programs. One is a historical remembrance program, and it was entitled the Freedom of Choice Remembrance Project. And that effort was to recognize those 13 students that first integrated Louisa County High School. As a result of the efforts of last year, we have a marker on the grounds of Louisa County High School. We erected that in February 12th. And so as you drive by or stop by, you will see the 13 names of the students, the 13 students under the Freedom of Choice plan that first integrated Louisa County High School. That freedom of choice gave students the right to choose what school they would like to go to, and these students were the first to initiate that. The second program is the Oral History Initiative. As I mentioned, part of the problem was that the archives didn't reflect the wholesomeness of the African American community, and the effort was to just outreach more, find those voices of the elderly, and find those stories of those that were living through in the community. And it's an ongoing effort because this is not new to do oral history, but it's new to do a strong outreach toward the African American community. So we hope that you have some nominees that you can refer us to, or if you are from Louisa, worked, lived, played in Louisa, you're welcome to be an interviewee. And the third project, research of the best practices to form a curriculum for local African American history in the local schools. Many of our leaders or people that have done remarkable things are right here in the community, and some have left, and we never knew that they did those things until other areas recognized them. So this is an effort to give a fuller context to history, find out what the people were doing, how they lived, what they thought about, what they experience and share that for generations to come. So today we have a speaker, Linda Quarles, out in Sebia, and she will talk about her experiences. It's entitled Outhouses, Tiled Walls, and Living Waters. So we celebrate today by listening to voices in community and bringing voices to the community to share valuable resources. So I want to say that following her presentation, it will be a question and answer period, and Caitlin Coughlin, our executive director, will give introduction to Linda at this time.
All right. So we have a really interesting outlook here. One of the things that's really great about Linda's presentation is you're going to find out a lot about her and what has informed her growing up and kind of her sense of self. She is a researcher, writer, and public speaker who addresses historic and contemporary Black equestrianism, which is not something most people do. So we're really excited to have her on board here with us. She was inspired originally in a class from about African history as a child, and her family and family values and history in Louisa County has created a lifelong passion for African and African American history and culture. She's got a love of horses, obviously, and that's been combined with this overarching interest in Black history, and that has really sparked her research, writing, and presentations to link the values of inclusion and fairness with a vision which she calls equestrian equality. She's currently a groom in training at Red Horse Equine Training and School, and she works with horses of various breeds and levels of training. She's really interested in understanding the bond between the human and the horse and looking at the ways that, identity and self combine with that. She lives in Louisa County. She's a member of the Historical Society. And, we're really excited to hear a little bit more about her and her approach to life and how she has made it to this point in her life. So we're really excited, and we thank you so much for doing this. This will be a great presentation. So I'm going to pull up the slides and we'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you. I consider it quite an honor to be able to speak to you today. And for your audience, I'm a little tech challenged, so this may be interesting. I didn't know if I wanted to read to you today or talk to you today. And so we're going to do a little bit of both. I'm going to read you some stuff and then hopefully we'll talk. All right. So let's get started. Outhouses, tiled walls, and living water. Caitlin, should I be telling you next screen? Okay.
Yep.
Next. Okay. I am not, I'm not born or raised in Louisa, but I stand here as a native daughter, if only a native granddaughter with deep roots in this region, because I descend from Quarleses and Timberlicks of Fluvanna in Louisa County. Other surnames in my family include Bishop, Burden, Kavanaugh, Fisher, Hackney, Johnson, Price, and Perkins. Some, likely most of my ancestors, as the slide says there, were enslaved or descendants of the enslaved. And purportedly, some were free Blacks. And my ancestors compose an admixture of ethnicities. So that background and experience are typical, I think, and consistent with any chronicling of African American life and experience that's written. And so what I'm going to tell you today, I think all of our stories are kind of a song of America. And as I consider my childhood memories in Louisa, I keep thinking of a poem, I Too Am America, by Langston Hughes, who was also a descendant of Louisa Quarleses. And I hope this talk isn't just about me. I hope that, and I anticipate that there will be some things that resonate with you other folk who live in Louisa, maybe are from Louisa or have come here, because the bottom line is that we do stand on common ground. And so that's where I'm going with that. Next slide, please. Okay. Today I'm going to concentrate on one branch of my family, and that's the Timberlicks, with a spotlight on one woman and how she forged a sense of family, home, and place despite the odds. But I'm not ready to introduce her yet. In my notes I am, but I'm not, according to the screen. What you're looking at now is a copy of a deed, and it speaks to my prehistory. My prehistory begins with Spencer Timberlick, born circa 1804 in Fluvanna and deceased in September 1 of 1880. The earliest mention of Spencer is found in a deed, that's a portion of it, between Ann Smith and Abner Houchins. In consideration of the natural love and affection that she bears for Abner Houchins and $1 in hand, Miss Smith Houchins gives Houchins a Negro woman named Judy and her 3 sons, Peter, Werther, and Spencer, and 1 Negro boy, Robert, presumably not a child of Judy's, and they being the same Negroes which he, Abner, has had in his possession for the past 7 years. This deed is filed at the Louisa County Courthouse in Deed Book R, page 248, and dated October 13th, 1828. Now, these people are probably a dowry gift. And I don't know how Anne originally obtained Spencer and the other humans in her possession. Spencer's death record records that he was born in Fluvanna, so I don't know how Anne got him in Louisa. But that's one of my next genealogical challenges. So Spencer is mentioned in the will also of Abner Houchins. It's will book number 12, page 491, in November 22 of 1849. And it states, I lend to my wife Ann Houchins all my estate, real and personal, to wit, the tract of land on which I live. All of my Negroes, Peter, Werther, Spencer, Norbin, Francis, and her child, Julian, and their increase during her life. He goes on to say, he wills that his assets be divided by his Negroes and that his Negroes should choose their master. He further states that should any of the Negroes be disobedient to his wife, it's his desire that they will forfeit any claim to his estate, and it's his desire that she sell that disobedient Negro, use the money, and use that to get another Negro. So in other words, Abner does not want dear Ann to be without Negroes, and he's making every provision for that. Next screen. So together, the deed where Ann is giving the humans and Abner's will illustrate that, like so many game pieces or trading cards, Judy and her children are passed between Abner and Ann. Next. Ann Houchins' will, located in Will Book 15, page 298 in the Louisa County Courthouse, was executed on February 10th, 1862, and completely obliterates the possibility of Abner's Negroes inheriting anything. Ann passed the remainder of her estate to different people. To my knowledge, no slaves or Negroes are mentioned. In fact, on the inventory of Ann's estate in Will Book 17, pages 278 and 280, dated February 11, 1862, there is very little left to the estate and no slaves are listed. So what happened to the slaves? Were they manumitted? Were they sold? Did they disobey and have to be sold? They were likely liberated when those Union boys came in, when we consider the date. Spencer appears in the, and I prematurely told you to give me that slide so you guys can enjoy that and guess where I'm going, okay? Spencer appears in the Freedmen Bureau Register of Colored Persons in Louisa who have been cohabitating as man and wife, and who are married legally by virtue of the Act of the General Assembly of the State of Virginia passed February 27th in 1866. The Louisa Historical Society, source, cohabitation list of former slaves in Goochland, Hanover, and Louisa counties, as recorded by the Freedmen's Bureau and transcribed by Janice Abercrombie, lists Spencer on page 87. He is recorded as Timberlicks, spelled a little differently, Spencer, 65, who is marrying Cynthia, age 50. He's a farmer, has a former wife named Anna, and this is where I got excited, who is dead. I didn't get excited because she was dead. Anna, who's dead, and had children by her who are now living, named Henry, Elois or Alvin, Cephas, Jenny, and Hardinia. Here's my Cephas. There's my Cephas. You're looking at my Cephas. My Josephus, who my grandmother Tessie always talked about, her grandfather. So I was quite excited when I found that reference to Cephas, because or to Spencer, because I had seen Spencer's name on Josephus's death certificate, and it was exciting to find him in your source. So according to Grandma Tessie, Cephas's mother was a full-blooded Indian. We often hear that lore in the African American community. I haven't found a source to confirm that, but one does see in his face there the high cheekbones that are often characteristic of Native people. It's a feature that's walked through Tessie and her children, but the jury's still out on that. What we do know about Cephas is that he was a shoemaker. My brother has one of his shoemaking tools, and his death record confirms his trade. Cephas is variously called Cophas or Cepha or Josephus or Joseph Timberlake. And he married Joanna Hackney, and they were parents of Katie and John Patrick Pat Timberlake. Pat is my great-grandfather. Now, this woman sitting there next to Cephas is not Joanna. She's Miss Sissy, a woman that he married later. Next slide, please. Oh, my battery's going low. Hold on 1 second. We don't want a low battery. Okay. So there we have John Patrick. Pat, or Grandpa, as we called him, lived a long life, and so I knew him. And what stuck out to my sister and I about him is that as melanated as his skin is, very dark-skinned man, he spoke with an Irish brogue that was so strong you'd have thought he was a leprechaun. And is there a name any more Irish than John Patrick Pat Timberlake? It's about as Irish as it gets. So Grandpa's manner of speaking is one reason why I have a problem with the univoice given to enslaved people by Hollywood. Because the fact of the matter, the reality is that enslaved people spoke like their enslavers, whether that enslaver was rich or poor, or Englishman or woman, German or Irish. And even though Pat here was born after slavery, I think he was enough in the environment that he spoke that way. And our family would kind of joke him. He could be a little cantankerous. That might be an Irish thing. I don't know, fighting Irish. But whenever if they were driving along and the conversation was going that he didn't like, he'd say, put me out right here. And my sister and I we giggled. Why does Grandpa talk like that? So John Patrick Timberlake was born 3rd of January in 1887, and he died on the 31st of January in 1972. He was a tobacco farmer and a woodman, and purportedly had a steady relationship with the Purcell lumber operation. On census records, he's consistently listed as one who owns his own home with no mortgage, works as a farmer for himself. My Aunt Cleolive, his granddaughter, lived with him for many years, and she mentioned that he had a house with plastered walls and oriental rugs. In fact, he had 2 houses, as she recalled, and both were destroyed by fire. Concerning the second fire, Aunt Cleolive said that because his wife, Ida Rebecca, next slide, please. I think Ida's in the next slide. Yes, that's Ida Rebecca, was sickly, and so Pat cooked biscuits every day. And on one of those days, a fire erupted. After the house burned down, Pat and Ida went to live with their daughter, Tessie, and that's Tessie's house that you see there. Next slide, please. And I'm guessing, yes. I frequently visited John Patrick's house off of Route 250, and I was shown a burial marker that told the grandma Ida was buried there. These are the remains of that home, that rubble that you're seeing there now, and I just took that picture the other day. When I took this picture, I thought the possessions can easily be reduced to wood, stubble, and hay, and how very important foundations are. There's also on the property, next please, a mound of burial stones called cairns. I discovered the cairns were common features in many places in the world, and they were common among African Americans and Native American burial sites. So maybe Grandma Tessie's claims of some Indian ancestry are true. I don't know. But you see there's Ida Rebecca, who's my grandmother's mother, and a single marker, which is her burial marker. And then there's a mound, and I couldn't get a real good picture of that, but it's sometimes you'll see burial stones in a circle, but these are mounded one on top of another. They're really quite beautiful with the moss. Next slide, please. There we go. I'm guessing, but I'm getting it right. Grandma Tessie Adele Timberlake, that's my grandmother. She was born February 24th, 1911. She died in September of 1997, September 12th. And she's a matriarch that I knew as a child and my direct connection to Louisa. And how queer it is for me that now I'm the matriarch in the family. I have to pinch myself every now and then. But Grandma Tessie, who preferred to be called Mama Tessie, an appellation that my sister and I gave her as when we were little, but we discarded later, was a very interesting and striking woman. Were I to summarize her, I would say that she had a very strong sense of herself. She was a real can-do person who seemingly just didn't entertain the possibility of no or can't do. In that way, she could be characterized as strong-willed. And I guess that could work as a positive or a negative. The positive evidence that her strong will worked for us is that she was very industrious and had consistently high aspirations. And she instilled a can-do mentality in her children as well. The downside of that quality is that her strength and perhaps independence may have collided with her marriages. Grandma Tessie was married 4 times and never because of widowhood. She was the only girl in her family and the middle child with 2 brothers. Next slide, please. And those are her 2 brothers. On the left is Uncle Herman Gillis Timberlake. He was born on the 29th of January, 1907, and he died April 7 of 1974. With my child's mind, he was the equivalent to, and I'm probably dating myself, but on the Andy Griffith Show, if anybody ever remembers that, there was a character named Otis, who was kind of the town drunk, oftentimes put himself in jail. And in my mind, Uncle Gillis was kind of like that. I think I saw him inebriated more times than not. He liked his drink. And I frequently recall my aunt, his niece, peering out of the front door and announcing to her mother, "Mama, here comes Gillis, and he's drunk as a skunk." Now, the child in me tried to imagine a drunk skunk, but Uncle Gillis was a pleasant drunk. He might stagger down the walk when he walked and look at you with glassy eyes, but it was a gentle stare. And he and I had a reoccurring game that I didn't recognize as a game until I was older. I was a child in our family who, whenever we came down, none of the locals knew me. They remembered my sister and they remembered my brother, but they could never remember my name. And so I was always curious who knew me or not. So when Uncle Gillis would come staggering down the path and say to me, "Hey, little one," I say, "You don't even remember my name, do you?" And so he'd put his hand in his pocket and he'd kind of stagger back and forth and he'd pull out a matchbox and squint at it and then say, Linda, that's your name." And I'd say, "But you had to look it up." And it wasn't until later I realized that was his vaudevillian joke with me, pulling out the matchbox. But, and I think part of the reason that people locally didn't know me is because my sister Donna was a bit older than me. She was here much more frequently. My grandmother took her places. And my grandmother told this story. Donna was always a very orderly and neat little girl. She was an orderly and neat adult too. And even as a child, she was very sensitive to disarray. And my grandmother Tessie tells a story about taking Donna to visit somebody locally once. And Donna sitting there in her little dress and her crossed legs. And I looked at the floor and said, "Grandma, this floor sure is dirty." And so my grandmother laughed when she told us the story, but she said she was mortified, at the host's house. Naturally, she would be. But so Donna was a ladylike child when we came down here. I was the tomboy child and likely not in the house, and that may be why people never knew me, because I was out exploring. So that was that. Uncle Gillis was never married, but you see his girlfriend there. He had a common law wife. Um, they didn't have any children. In many ways, Uncle Gillis was like the beloved black middle sheep of the family. But on one occasion, his dad, Pat Timberlake, who I told you could be cantankerous, um, had Gillis arrested because Gillis cursed at him on a Sunday. Pat was wanting to go to church. Gillis used the D word. I'll be there in a few D minutes, and that was more than Pat could take. And Pat Timberlake, I understand, had quite a bit of influence with local authorities here, and so he had Uncle Gillis arrested. And many of the times that we came down to visit, I found out later, my dad was trying to convince his granddad to let Uncle Gillis out. Uncle Gillis was incarcerated for a while because of our dear stubborn Pat Timberlake. But as I became older, I often pondered why this very sweet man, sweet gentleman, consistently self-medicated himself. Uncle Gillis's death certificate does, in fact, say that he died from alcohol intoxication. A family member confided to me another possibility, and that was murder. And one of the things I've learned about family history is that some family histories are just unknowable, and they go to the grave with the individual, and maybe that's for the best. The man on the right, in the photo on the right, if you look to the far right, you see a woman with glasses on and a man sitting next to her, and that is my beloved Uncle Mickey. He was born April 19th, 1913. He died September 8th, 1988. Aunt Flora is in the picture with him. She was his common law wife, and they never married, but they had an enduring and deep committed love. Aunt Flora was Flora Biggs from Alabama. Uncle Mickey loved me unconditionally, and I could write a book about him, but I'll keep it short. Mickey left Louisa and headed for Washington after having one too many harvests of tobacco and not being compensated as he said he was going to. And he laughed later and said, I threw that hoe down and said, that's the last time I'm going to pick up a hoe. And so he went to work for the government. Next slide, please. Okay. Church and family were very important structures in Grandma Tessie's life, in fact, in the whole family life. And these two churches are especially significant. The original of those churches were built by my great-great-grandfather Quarles. Joseph Lee Quarles was a carpenter. I have not determined if his father was enslaved. Joseph Lee probably was not, because he was born in 1864. Or if he was enslaved, he was a skilled enslaved man. And so he built County Line Baptist, the original County Line Baptist church structure that you see on the right. And the family story was that when he was finishing the roof, he went blind and people had to help him down. Now, to me, that sounds a little too close to the Sistine Chapel, but that's a family story. Okay. On the left is Galilee Baptist Church. And Galilee Baptist Church was started by a white church in Kent Store, Virginia, called Beulah Baptist. And the congregants at Beulah Baptist wanted to open a church for their colored congregants. And Thomas Shepard, who may have been the enslaver of my two Josephs, my great-great-grandfather and his father, both named Joseph, or may not. But younger Joseph was in his employ at one point. So he contracted younger Joseph to build that church. So County Line, the church on the right, was my family's home church, but they frequently visited Galilee, which was just up the road. So church and family were central to Grandma Tessie, who I'm featuring today. She was an avid churchgoer. She was very hospitable, and pastors came to her house frequently for Sunday dinners. She liked finery, whether that expressed itself in clothing. Her church, like most Black women, her church hats were a priority. And she also expressed her like of finery in her dishes, her vehicles, and tiled walls on her living room and dining room floors. Her children were her delight, and she smiled easily. She laughed easily. That's what I remember about her. She appreciated a good joke and humorous circumstances, but she seemed happiest. The thing that made her happiest was when her kids were gathered together, and that meant when we came down with my dad. And she liked to lavish gifts and to be lavished with gifts. And so there would be gifts. But I wouldn't call her a domestic goddess. She wasn't much of that. I think she preferred to relegate those kind of roles to other people. But on the occasion of her kids coming down, she put on her apron and prepared a big meal, and it was a whole different tune. Next slide, please. And those are her 4 children. Aunt Cleala was on the far left. She was born November 18th in 1932. She died March 30th in 2017. She married Uncle Walter Kavanaugh and she was in elementary school. And she's the first Black Southern belle I've ever met. I'll tell you more about her later. She was quiet, delicate, and demure. Her stated hobby was shopping, and this hobby was expressed in her dress, the way she decorated her classroom and her homes. The little boy next to her is my father, Ellis, and you'll hear more about him. And the third baby is Louise. And then the child to the far right is my Aunt Lorraine, and you'll hear more about all of them. Next slide, please. And there are Aunt Cleala and Aunt Lorraine. You can probably guess who's the demure one. That's the one on the left. She didn't smoke. She didn't drink. She was very, like I said, very Southern bellish, the first Black Southern belle I'd ever met. And you can see her precocious little sister next to her with a twinkle in her eyes. Aunt Lorraine was everybody's sweetheart. If she was your aunt, she was your favorite aunt. If she was your friend, she was your best friend. I don't think I ever heard her say a mean thing about anyone. She truly had a joie de vivre. She enjoyed life. Technically, she's my father's stepsister, but we never dealt with steps in our family. My Aunt Cleala was the child of my grandfather, Joseph Quarles. Aunt Lorraine was the daughter of a man named Mr. Lumpkins. She wanted to name me. When I was 14 when she was 14 when I was born, and she wanted to adopt me. And the family said, "No, you're too young. You can't adopt her." And she wanted to name me Zipporah, which I was glad she didn't name me Zipporah, because Zipporah Quarles would have been a mouthful, But Zipporah means little bird, and her husband, Uncle Bobby, my beloved Bobby, gave me the nickname of Half Pint when I was little. And I'd say, but that's just a cup, But that's what he called me. She was born in Washington, D.C., and she got married in 1963, and she was living with us. She was born in Washington, but then moved back down here. But she was living with us in Washington when she got married, and she was working as a stenographer. And she got married December 15th, 1863. I just turned 10, and I got to be a flower girl. Her death in 1971 was fresh. She was a fresh 31-year-old, and it was my first traumatic experience with death. Next slide, please. And here we have my grandfather on the left, Charles Ellis Quarles Sr., and my grandmother, Tessie, on the right. And there's a schism there. They got married in 1929. In all honesty, it may have been a convenient marriage. Tessie was 18. She was pregnant with my father. They married and quickly moved to Washington. The marriage didn't endure. Like many who lived during the Great Migration, though, Southern Blacks moved northward. My grandma Tessie Adele Timberlake and her husband Charlie Ellis Quarles moved to Washington sometime around 1929. They were both from this region. Charles having been born in Columbia, Fluvanna in 1908, and Tessie in Louisa County in 1911. I'm uncertain of the exact time the granddad and grandma Tessie lived in Washington, but she was there when her first child, my father, Charles Ellis Quarles, nicknamed Junior, was born on June 10th, 1929. Tessie came home to Louisa briefly to have her third child, my Aunt Cleolive, born here and delivered by her grandmother, or her step-grandmother, Sally Price, or better known as Miss Sissy. Miss Sissy was the woman that you saw in the picture with Cephas. She was what's the word I'm looking for? Midwife. She was a midwife. And Aunt Cleolive used to say in her little Southern belle that she had to wait because Miss Sissy went to the white people first, and so she had to wait. And I thought, well, you didn't have to wait. Your mom had to wait, but she saw it as she having to wait. But so that was the situation. By 1940, though, Granddaddy and Grandma Tessie were divorced, and Charlie moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he had siblings who had long before migrated to north. And Tessie had married a man, George Lumpkins, Aunt Lorraine's father, and gave birth to Aunt Lorraine, who was Lorraine Maxine Lumpkins. Next slide, please. And there we have a slide, the same slide of the two children. We've got Daddy and Aunt Cleolive on my left. I keep saying left, but it's probably your right. And then we've got Aunt Lorraine and Aunt Cleolive on the left. And in the center is the home they moved down here. So around 1942, Grandma Tessie purchased her home and moved back to Louisa. And the story of how she obtained that home, and I think it speaks a lot of the times. It's very interesting. Grandma Tessie, when she lived in Washington, was a domestic. She was a maid. And her husband, Charles, was the gardener. And they worked for a wealthy family. When Charles and Tessie were divorced and Charles went to Philadelphia, Grandma Tessie's brother, Gillis, took over the gardening position. And one day, Gillis and Tessie were having a conversation, and the woman that they worked for overheard it. And Tessie was saying that she wanted to buy that house. And Gillis said to her, Tessie, you're crazy. You can't buy that house. White people own that house. Well, that was when redlining was in full force in Louisa and every place where Jim Crow's laws worked. And that was that. Well, the employer overheard that conversation. And so sometime later, she asked Grandma Tessie to drive her to Louisa. And not sure why she wanted her to do that, my grandmother nonetheless complied. When they got to Louisa, the woman asked her to take her to the courthouse. And she took her to the courthouse. And the end of the story is that the woman purchased a house for Tessie and went into a contractual arrangement where Tessie would work off for the house. So Tessie worked for 7 years before she could move into that house. But she eventually moved into it because of what you and I might call an ally, a very generous ally in this day and age. So, but before the move, Grandma Tessie's second child told her mom, she said, Mama, you're really going to like your house. She said, it'll be a nice house, but I won't be there with you. And confused, Grandma Tessie asked the child what she meant. And Louise turned to walk up the stairway. And she reportedly sat down on the staircase and said, Mama, I'm so tired, but I see them. And my grandmother's getting panicked. And she says, who do you see? What do you see? And Louise said, the angels, and they're coming for me. And then she died moments later. And from that time, my grandmother always said two things. One, that Louise was a prophet. And two, she would always say, and I can understand her saying it, though I don't share the sentiment, don't love your child too much because the Lord will take him away. So it was it was a mixture of tragedy and joy that Grandma Tessie happened to buy that house. So when Grandma Tessie moved back, next slide, please, she was distressed that the colored children in Louisa County didn't have bus transportation to school. So she bought a school bus. And she began driving Black children to school. Now, I'd read that there were other organizations that were trying to get school bus transportation going. I've often wondered if she worked with those organizations. I don't know. But she did drive a bus, and she did purchase them in the time when the county wasn't purchasing them. And she drove for quite a long time. I mean, into my childhood. And in fact, her backspace in her house was often littered with buses that had rusted out. And they were usually severed and put to some other purpose. My father, whom you see on your left, was 13, around 13 when his mom moved down here, and he also drove a bus. Now, I don't know how that happened legally, but Daddy did a lot of things that were not normal or that were ahead of his age. Next slide, please. An example is on my right, you see Daddy in high school with his high school girlfriend, and in high school he was selling life insurance. And after he graduated from high school early, and then he moved to Washington and started an insurance agency. From there, he started a cosmetics manufacturing and sales company in Philadelphia. And he hired his dad to do door-to-door sales, kind of Avon style. And Daddy would later say that experience with the cosmetics company was his hardest and most important lesson in business. He had discovered that some employees were pilfering from the company, and he addressed the matter. They quit, and he couldn't sustain the company without them. And so he sold the company to a lion in the industry, Fuller Brush Company. And he said he realized later that it would have been much better for him to just absorb the loss of the theft than to have lost the shop. Next slide, please. That's not the one I wanted. Can we go again? Yeah, that's what I wanted. Okay. Back in Washington, Charles Ellis Quarles Jr. opened a chain of dry cleaners. He started what would be his main enterprise, which was Edna Employment Agency, and he opened that restaurant a block away from Howard University. And he cleverly called it Howard's Fine Foods. And I think these are the things when I said that Grandma Tessie was a kind of can-do person and kind of passed that on. I think he kind of picked that up too. Howard's Fine Food was a diner. It had a counter when you went in, and you could either sit in the booth or at the counter. And on the left was a banquet area. And when I was a little girl, I used to beg to work the cash register. The answer was no go. My father laughed and said I would probably, give all his money away. And that might have been true. That might have been wisdom. Daddy did employ some of his Quarles relatives who moved up from Washington because, as you know, with what's called the Great Migration, often a family member went and others followed. And so Daddy did oftentimes employ people to work at his restaurant or his dry cleaners. And he also let my older sister sometimes work the register when she was a tween. But despite the continuous demand of his businesses, my dad was always drawn back to Louisa. I think Daddy was a restless serial entrepreneur, and Louisa provided him, I think, rest and opportunity. And so he applied some of his business sense to buying property in Louisa or investing in Black Angus cattle or harvesting trees to sell in Washington at Christmas time. And he even opened a nightclub, I think it was in Fluvanna, called the Blue Bow. And it's my intention to go. I don't know if counties keep those kind of records, but I want to go there and see if there is a business license in a particular area. I was the very shy opening act oftentimes for his things. I tell little corny jokes that he liked to tell, and I'm sure people thought that was his kid again, but that was Daddy. Next slide, please. And there's a situation where Daddy's at the Blue Bow and he's watching this quartet or trio. I can't tell if that's 3 or 4 people, but they're practicing. Next slide, please. Okay, so Daddy, we came down here often, and there's certain landmarks that will always be dear to me. That's one of them. At one point, Daddy owned that barn, And now when I drive through it, it just always feels like childhood in Louisa to me. And I'll be very sad when it goes. It's right there in 250, right at 250 and I think 604. Um, and Daddy was always, it seemed, in a hurry to get to Louisa. He hugged those dusty dirt roads with the skill and precision of surfer riding waves. And his affection for Louisa was contagious to me. The stories that he told were exciting, silly little stories, but like about a cat that he had who could, Daddy swore, hunt better than any foxhound. And so we frequently came to Louisa, whether it was just coming for the weekend or coming for a special occasion like County Line Baptist Church's anniversary and revival kickoff. We simply knew it as Third Sunday because it occurred the third Sunday in August. And it was probably the most important thing on our family's calendar. Third Sunday was about church revival time, but it was also just about community time. And there were people who rarely went to church at all who showed up on Third Sunday. For our family, it was never a question of if we were coming to Third Sunday. I'm going to put my jacket on because I'm freezing and shivering. But it was never a question of if we were coming to Third Sunday. It was when we were coming. Were we coming Friday night or Saturday morning? And that varied. And in weeks before Third Sunday, there was shopping to be done. There was food to be purchased. There were new clothes and new shoes. Third Sunday was more important, I think, to us than Easter. And you had some of the same things going on: new clothes, food. But the charming thing that happened at County Line, and I came to understand that it's a Southern tradition, was that people would bring meals. The whole church would have a picnic on the grounds between services. And for me, it was a learning time because not only was it fun because the women in my family were up all night frying chicken or cooking country ham or straightening hair or putting hot water in a galvanized tub to bathe my sister and I. Because when my entrepreneurial grandmother bought the house, I think initially when she bought it, there wasn't a kitchen. So I think she added a kitchen. There were years of no indoor plumbing, which is how I got to know outhouses very well. And part of the whole hoopla with Third Sunday was water being boiled on the pot, on the black cast iron stove, poured into a galvanized pan or bucket, tub, and Donna and I getting a bath and getting that bath before we got our hair straightened because we didn't want the hair to sweat back and get nappy. So that was part of the ritual. And people were up all night. The men were oftentimes playing cards. The women were cooking. Jazz was usually playing on the stereo. And I remember saying, I don't like that. How do you guys like that music? And my mom saying, you'll like it when you get older. You'll like it when you get older. And she was right. So Third Sunday was a big, big time. What struck me is that every family from the church bought a meal, and you'd go around to different people's table and sample what they had. But you learned manners. You learned not to load your plate from other people's table like you loaded it from your own. I, the Tom girl, learned how not to get my patent leather shoes dirty with red clay. I could never sustain any curls because I was too busy doing this and looking at little boys. And I was excited to know that after the lunch, people didn't necessarily go back into church, which was fun for me because I could play outdoors. So Third Sunday was a big, big deal, a big tradition. And visiting Louisa gave the opportunity for a lot of traditions to grow into. So sometimes, like I said, we came late, and sometimes we came just on a normal weekend, and sometimes we came late Friday night after Mom and Dad had rested from work. At other times, we'd start out early in the morning, aiming to get to Louisa in time for a good country breakfast. And it was eggs and country ham and thick cut bacon from hogs that Grandma Tessie raised, pancakes or biscuits with thick King brand syrup, maybe cornbread cooked in a large cast iron skillet. hash brown potatoes, fried apples. Now, to be honest, I never thought Grandma Tessie was that good of a cook. She scrambled her eggs in bacon grease and without milk, and that made them brown, and they weren't fluffy like my mom's, who put milk in them and cooked those with butter. But once I got beyond the sight of things and sometimes the smell, think chitlins, I fell in love with Virginia country cooking. Still preferred mom's, but looked forward to. There's nothing better than a ham biscuit, a country ham biscuit. But I think I liked those morning trips better than the evening trips. Not so much for the breakfast, but because Daddy and I were usually the only ones awake, and we were coming into Louisa as the sun was coming up, and there were cows, and he would teach me what a Guernsey cow was, or what a Holstein was, or what the difference was between a milk cow and a beef cow. So that was always a lot of fun. And but then I become distressed when Daddy created roadkill, which he often did, by deliberately trying to hit a pheasant, a quail, or wild turkey ever so lightly and precisely with his car. I'd cry and fuss and tell him that I thought it was mean. And my dad would laugh and flip the script and say, well, what was Daddy supposed to do? Have an accident trying to miss the quail? But I saw through that, especially as he happily hopped out of the car, tossed the flesh in the trunk, and held it like a trophy when he got to his mother's house so that she could fix it. And for as much as I was opposed to it, I enjoyed the fowl too, I have to admit. But Louisa offered all kinds of lessons and adventures that I never experienced in Washington and or later in my suburban community. Next slide, please. And that's one of them. Ferncliff Market was the place it's one of the landmarks, no less a landmark to me than that barn, because Ferncliff was where you could go and get huge hand-dipped ice cream. If you ever go into Ferncliff, in that table now where there's like, I think a hot dog machine or whatever, that was a big freezer where hand-dipped ice cream came from. And everybody had their favorite. Mine was lemon. Mom's was butter brickle. Daddy's was butter pecan. My Aunt Lorraine's was, whatever. And so it was a treat to go to Ferncliff. That was one of the highlights of coming down here. There was also the county fair, which was the place that I learned to eat French fries with vinegar and black pepper. I learned that's a Canadian thing, but I got it first in Louisa. And there was, Louisa for me was a paradise because it's a place that I could come and collect turtles. I'd go down to a spring at my grandmother's house. That's the living water thing. And she would say, be careful those terrapins, she called them. But I'd go down and get turtles, try to have turtle races. I think I had a turtle and the hare thing going on in my head and expected them to race. And of course, they tried to escape and go off into their directions. But those were the kind of things I did. And those were experiences that I didn't have in Washington. I used to scrape moss from the bottom of tree trunks. They made excellent grass for my Barbie's dream house. The pitch black nights without street lights were a bit scary. And the use of a cesspot at night to urinate in was not pleasant. But there was something magical about the sound of rain on a tin roof, or the smell of burning wood from a potbelly stove that was serving both as a cooking source and a heating source. It was a trade-off. You had the stinky pot, and it was a little scary at night, but you couldn't beat that smell. Experiencing an outhouse for the first time was terrible, and I never got used to it. Not only was there the stench, but there were yellow jackets flying around in there. And I would look at the toilet paper hanging on a makeshift rod of wood and think, is that really clean? Is that really sanitary? And the biggest fear for me was, what would happen if you fell in there? And then it was a shock to know that not only were there outhouses at my grandma's house, Other people had outhouses, and there were even outhouses at church. So it was like no escaping outhouses. You just had to learn to navigate outhouses. But but not far from the outhouse was the wicked delight and distraction of the pig pen. I say wicked delight because there were some experiences that I had that kind of resonate as kind of Huck Finn kind of things, Scout Finch kind of things, and one of them was this: my sister and I had a horrible, for whatever horrible reasons, liked to torment my grandmother's pigs. Um, I don't know why. Don't ask me. Just call us wicked little girls. But we caught great delight in taunting them. And so we would ask my grandmother if we could feed them dried corn. And of course, she'd turn us down, but we'd persist and beg. And she'd say, and we said we wanted to give the pigs a treat. And she'd let us. And so we would gather some corn and call the pigs. And when they came, we'd throw it at them. And it was a delight for us to see the pigs and their little piglets squealing. But we got paid back one day, and chalk it up to Looney Tunes. Maybe it's watching too many Looney Tunes. I don't know, too much Daffy Duck or whatever. But we got paid back because in the summer, my grandmother would invite two girls from around the road to come and play with us, and they were Peggy and Brenda. And I liked those girls. They were a lot of fun. They were nice, and they had a big family, which we didn't have a big family, so I envied them. They had a big family, lots of sisters and brothers, and they had a white horse, so I thought they had the best of all lives. But they would come down and they would play with us, and so one day they came down, and we decided to go down to my favorite spot, which was the spring, because I had discovered spring water, again, living water. When I first discovered spring water, the idea of drinking water from the ground seemed gross, but it was so cold and so clean and so fresh that it was the best water in the world. That and well water. You couldn't beat it. And it was also a good place to get turtles. So I hung down at the spring a lot. So my sister and Peggy and Brenda and I went down to the spring. And Don and I, being city girls, Wranglers had just come out and we were all about that. So we had Wranglers. But girls in the 50s wore skirts when you played. You even wore skirts when you wore skirts and shorts under things when you played, but we had on jeans. But Peggy and her sister had on dresses, and we were down there having a good time. And all of a sudden, that sow, whose piglets we had harassed, came running down with her teeth flowing. And they say that pigs are very intelligent, and I believe it because she had determination in her eyes and she had vengeance in her eyes. And so suddenly, we just scrambled to get away from her. It's all good for Don and I. We hopped under the fence, but then, we had to hold the barbed wire fence. Next slide, please. I think it should be there. Yes, we had to hold the barbed wire fence for Peggy, who got through, but then her sister Brenda got her dress stuck on the wire. And so we were scrambling to get her dress unhooked and not tear the dress and get away from the hog. And looking back, when I watched things like To Kill a Mockingbird and saw Jem and Scout scrambling to get under fence, or imagine some mischief that one of Mark Twain's characters had done, Louisa always came to mind. Next slide. And that is supposed to be, it's a bad rendition, but that's supposed to be a representation of rain on a tin roof. Nothing like it. Next slide. And autumn. Autumn was always my favorite time. I'm born in the autumn. Autumn was the time that a few things would happen. One, my dad would take me hunting. Now, I hated hunting. I would threaten to be loud so the animals would run away. And when we saw a rabbit or something, I'd say, run, little rabbit, run. I later realized that Daddy wasn't taking me hunting because he was serious about hunting. He was just having downtime with his little girl. Another feature of a Louisa feature that I noticed is that my father's cousin Arthur, who also had made a migration move to Maryland, would come down to hunt. Next picture, please. Oh, that's a potbelly stove. Next picture, please. Oh, okay. Next picture, please. I'll stop it. We'll get to that picture. I'll let you know. I'll do this when we get there. But Cousin Arthur would bring his dogs down, and I love dogs. And I thought, oh, great fun. Well, he wouldn't let me touch the dogs. They were special dogs. I felt sorry for their specialness because they couldn't even be touched. They couldn't be pet, but they were his hunting dogs. I thought they were the cutest beagles in the world, but I was quickly corrected and let it and informed that they were foxhounds. So cousin Arthur would come down with a truck and these crates of dogs, and they were doing hunting, and they had fun, but I thought it was kind of cruel. Creek where I would get hogs is what that is. The one before that, flowers, wildflowers were my big thing in the spring. Every season seemed to have its thing. And in the spring and summer, it was wildflowers. In the springtime, it was picking blackberries, sometimes enough for my grandmother to make cobbler, which she often did. Or it was picking the blossoms off of fruit trees, even though I was told not to. Of course, you pick the blossoms off, it's what fruit you're going to get, but they were so fragrant. I couldn't resist. And I think it may be why today I like essential oils and I like all things herbal. And it wasn't the 60s and hippies who gave me that. Louisa gave me that. Next picture. Cars were a big thing. My family used to like to buy whatever was a new car. And I learned to drive here in Louisa and to drive stick shift. And in fact, part of the coming to Louisa tradition was that whenever my sister and I turned 15 and got learner's permits, you knew immediately that you were going to Louisa. And that trip meant that you were going to drive from Maryland in the suburbs where there was not so heavily populated, so traffic was relatively light, through city traffic in Washington, there was no 95, it was Route 1 all the way, down Route 1, through wilderness and rural roads. And at that time, there was not asphalt on the roads, there was clay. And there were any number of odd to us road signs like deer crossing or whatever. And so by the time you did that going down and coming back, by the end of that weekend, you had a pretty good sense of how to drive. Next slide. And there's my Aunt Lorraine with a Mustang. She was the one who bought whatever the latest sports car is. Next one. And that was her husband, Uncle Bobby. And that was when Volkswagen Beetle came out. Next one. And this is part of why I wanted to name my talk Outhouses, Tiled Walls, and Living Waters, is because one of the things that I value, that I learned in Louisa, my grandmother, yes, she was very upward mobile and, had this can-do thing, but people just dealt with the realities of life. And this is a house where my Uncle Gillis and his common wife lived for a while. It's also a house where my grandfather, whose two houses had burned down, lived in for a while. And it's the house that I remember visiting because I wasn't alive when he had the other houses. And today it's a house where storage is. Next slide. Oh, and let me go back. And that's on Nanny Burton Drive, and so we always refer to it as Nanny Burton. Now, my grandmother, as I mentioned, she had 4 husbands. Her name was Tessie Adele Timberlake Quarles Jackson Lumpkin and Sutton, and that was her last husband, Mr. Sutton. Next picture. So one of the things that I think that my grandmother did was she very much encouraged her daughters toward marriage. Because what I can say about my grandmother, and people may make judgments, I know I did, but I have to say that she at least believed in marriage. We can agree with that. And as a result, her 2 of her daughters, her only daughters, well, the one died, but they married and had happy marriages. And this is a Southern belle. She was a dainty little flower. She had this kind of Mona Lisa look in her wedding picture. So I thought, is she scared? Is she going to cry? Next picture. And there she is, driving away. Her husband was as sweet as can be. He was a Kavanaugh from these areas. Loved her dearly. Just a jewel of a man. Again, he's a person that I never saw speak anything unkind to anybody, and he had a tremendous amount of wisdom. He had a large family, and I remember coming down once when one of his sisters had died. I said, Uncle Walter, so sorry your sister died. And he says, and he was grieving, but he said, we're born to die. Yeah. Now he was a minister, and I'm sure that's where some of that wisdom came, but an adorable man. Next picture. And there they are again. They were both school teachers. He retired earlier than she did. He was also a war veteran in the Korean War and suffered, he paid his dues to our country. He suffered the effects of Agent Orange and a lot of other things. Next slide. And there's Aunt Lorraine, the one I told you was everybody's darling. And I put that picture there because it's so typical of her. There she's got her little dress on and a snowball, and she's ready to play. And that was Aunt Lorraine. She used to, I remember when I started wearing stockings, and you women who are younger won't be able to relate that, but we wore little garter belts. Even little skinny girls like me wore garter belts, and Aunt Lorraine would look at those big pretty eyes and kind of wink and say, what are you holding them up with? She also had a standing joke with my mom when Aunt Lorraine was single. She and my mom would be driving along, and people always thought that they were sisters because they were such good friends. But if they saw a good-looking man, Aunt Lorraine or mom would say, "Ooh, that's some cheesecake." Well, my sister and I would say, "Which cheesecake? Which cheesecake?" And so they'd say, "Oh, we'll tell you when you get 16." And so 16, by 16 we knew, but Aunt Lorraine, which cheesecake? Oh, I'll tell you when you get to be 21. So it was a standing joke, But she was a fun person. Next slide, please. And that was her husband, Uncle Bobby. He's the one who called me Half Pint. He was a lot of fun. When he and Aunt Lorraine got married, my sister and I used to love to go to their apartment. They were the cool aunt and uncle. And we'd rife through her drawers and find lingerie. And Donna would say to me, I didn't know Aunt Lorraine was that type. And I'd say, me either, that type. A married woman. Next one. And so this is at Aunt Lorraine's wedding. The woman in the front is my mom. She was a maid of honor, and she made all of their dresses, very 50s dresses. Aunt Lorraine got married at Christmas time, and so you see the Christmas theme going there. And there's Aunt Lorraine. Oh, I'm pointing like you can see me. But the last person sitting in the back is Aunt Cleolo. Next. And there was Aunt Lorraine. Being her flamboyant self on a windy December day. Next picture. And there's her wedding party. I'm the flower girl. The little boy is a little boy who grew up in the area. His father was a minister. And you see Aunt Lorraine and her spouse. My dad is in back of me. And there's a wedding party. And it's a shame that is so blurry, because when you look at all of these young men, you look at them and they've got little baby faces. These are young Black men just, doing that thing. Next. And they're the bridesmaids having, a toast in Dixie cups, no less. Next. And there's Daddy welcoming Uncle Bobby to the family. And there are the tiled walls. Next. And so this is Grub Store, which was right around the corner. It was, the country equivalent to 7-Eleven, or not 7-Eleven, 7-Eleven or Highs or whatever. And that was Grub Store. It's no longer a store now. And one of the things, for Louisa was a place of learning because it wasn't always pleasant things. Sometimes it was unpleasant things. So Louisa is the place, not a Grub Store, but Louisa is a place that when we came down from Washington, and Daddy was a bit showy. He didn't look down at people, and he wasn't arrogant. He thought he was the top of the heap, but he thought the whole world was the top of the heap. And let's all get to the top of the heap. He had that kind of big personality. And we would stop at these stores, and there would be these kids that were white, didn't have on shoes, didn't have, had stringy, dirty hair and dirty clothes and whatever. And I would kind of look down when I asked for, my baby Ruth or whatever, not because And you could tell that these kids didn't necessarily like serving us. You could tell that their parents did not necessarily like serving this flamboyant man, but they did. And I would look down because I didn't want to be literally looking down at them or feeling, whatever. But that was a learning thing. I remember coming into town and at the courthouse seeing signs, water signs that say white and colored, and asking my parents, what's that about? What is that? And they explained to us, white people have to, and black people drink in separate fountains. That was new to us. Next slide. And so that's not the Louisa. That's not from Louisa. That's a common Wiki Commons photograph, but that was the situation that was here, and we learned that here. There certainly was discrimination in Washington, but we didn't see it up close, or we didn't recognize it, I'll say, because I know that there was an upscale department store that, at Christmas time, we couldn't go in that store necessarily. So it happened in Washington, but it happened more flagrantly here. And then there was a situation, next slide, where my dad had an encounter with the KKK. We were going back, our routine coming and going was generally to stop at an Exxon just there as you got to Route 1 and fill up with gas or sodas or whatever. And Daddy had pulled up and a tractor trailer truck was fueling. And so he waited for quite a while. And then he said, I'm going to ask this guy if he'll move his truck up. So he got out of the car and was talking for a while. And then when he came back, he was walking like he was really angry. And men in the 50s always wear suits. So his suit jacket was going back and forth. And my mom kind of looks at him like, what's going on? And he said, I asked that fellow to move his truck up, and he pulled out his KKK emblem. But I told him I had a 38 that would take care of all of that. And I remember, and I did exactly what you just did, Kaylee. As a little girl, I remember feeling two things. Oh, Daddy could have gotten killed. We could have gotten killed. And the other thing was, Daddy didn't back down from the Ku Klux Klan, Now, I was distressed about the gun, but my father always had a gun. My grandma could shoot a rifle, throw a quarter up and shoot it with a rifle. In fact, when we came down, there were all contests in the family. They would give me the rifle, tell me to be sure to hold it, and somebody would hold it with me, and don't let it throw you back, but it would always throw me back. And to this day, I'm not a lover of guns, because I remember always a gun in Daddy's coat pocket, and always guns here in Louisa. And I was not that person, but my sons are talking me out of it. They're telling me I'm little and old and I need a gun. So next slide. And I remember massive resistance. My aunt Cleala was a school teacher, and we would come down and she didn't have school. And I thought the kids were so lucky because they didn't have school. And I'd hear the adults talking, but I didn't get it. And I later learned massive resistance and what that was all about. But I saw it up close and personal, but didn't recognize it at the time. Next. And so, how do you get beyond those kind of dynamics? My grandmother, like I said, was very entrepreneurial. She was big on education. And so both Aunt Lorraine and Aunt Cleala went to Virginia Union University. Daddy didn't. Daddy left, like I said, left high school and started exercising his entrepreneurial genes. Next. And there's Aunt Lorraine when she worked as a court stenographer in Washington. Next. And there's Aunt Cleala teaching here in Fluvanna High School. In fact, I went to school with a boy who, it turned out Aunt Cleala was his teacher. And I told Aunt Cleala, I said, Aunt Cleala, my friend John James was one of your students. And she says, oh, yes, JJ was. She says, and I remember the first day I called the roll, and I called him JJ, and he said, it's Mr. JJ to you. Next. Now, one of the things I learned about my family, and I appreciate this about the adults, we were a small family. I had one first cousin. I don't know anybody on the planet who has one first cousin. And we were a small family, but one of the things I appreciate about the adults, and I wish I was this kind of adult, and I'm working on being this in my family, is they knew how to enjoy themselves. And so this is my Aunt Lorraine's sweet 16 birthday party. You know, she had a sweet 16 birthday party in Louis. I never had a sweet 16 birthday party. We hear all these pictures of Aunt Lorraine and them having a sweet, and she's got a strapless dress on. That was so Aunt Lorraine, you know. And here's John Patrick in the far right, the grumpy Irish sounding grandfather. And there's a demure little Southern belle with some kind of foil thing around her, you know, right here, Louisa, you know. And there's my grandma Tessie. So she had a sweet 16 party. Also, when we would come down, next slide. Well, and there's my mom, my dad, and Aunt Lorraine. Next slide. Okay, my slides aren't in the sequence I thought. One of the things I appreciated is when we come down, we play softball. And my sister and I were the only kids, but it was so fun for us. And it wasn't like my parents and aunts and uncles invited other people over. They were hospitable when people came, but they could enjoy themselves, you know. And I think we kind of miss some of that. So I kind of want to, you know, well, my sons are kind of that way too, but I appreciate that. It didn't have to be, there didn't have to be outsiders to have fun. They just enjoyed each other. And here, you know, they had some kids over riding a horse. Now, my grandmother had a horse named George. I only rode George once or twice, and that was with Aunt Lorraine, who was her flamboyant self in a scarf. So I had no exposure to horses, but I think George is probably what has driven my older woman itch today. And I remember when George died, we had an elaborate funeral in the backfield of the house for him. We also had an elaborate funeral for that sow when she died, and Aunt Lorraine, with her very dramatic self, had a handkerchief and was, you know, lamenting the ham hocks and everything else that was going in the ground. Next one. That's it. That's the picture I wanted to see. That tree was where Grandma Tessie would make a picnic lunch. We'd lay a blanket out. There'd be fried chicken or whatever else. And that's where you hung out until it was your time at bat, you know. And like I said, these adults were having fun with each other because I, as a child, a 5, 6, 7-year-old child, now recall it as a fun time. Next. It's going to be, yeah. And so that was our softball field. And that was what the grown-ups did to entertain themselves when they weren't playing bid whist or whatever else. Next. And that was my Aunt Reese. She was a Quarles. She lived very nearby. There's the ring of, you know, what was Opie's there's an Aunt B vibe about her. You know, she always had on a gingham dress. There was always some kind of fruit pie or something in her house. She was a school teacher in Goochland and a devoted member of her church. Next. And that's Aunt Reese and cousin Arthur, her cousin Leroy, or Uncle Leroy, rather. Cousin Leroy. Uncle Leroy. That's what I'm trying to say. She was my mother, my father, my grandfather's cousin, and my father's uncle. Next. And there's Uncle Mickey, the beloved one who said he wasn't hoeing any more tobacco. Next. And that is where I'm residing now, and that's my Aunt Cleola's house. When she and my Uncle Walter got married, they put a trailer up just between my grandmother's house and where that space is, and they lived in that trailer for a couple of years until they could sell up, you know, until they could save to buy that house. And that to me, I think, is what I have come to appreciate is the balance with them between the tile and the no cesspool or whatever. I used to think some things were a little pretentious, but I've learned that they did what I don't necessarily successfully do and what our society doesn't do, which is wait or work towards something or have a goal. But she and Uncle Walter eventually built their house. And the plan was that Aunt Lorraine and Uncle Bobby were going to build on the other side, but Aunt Lorraine died at age 31. Next. And Daddy was, among other things, a a bishop of a church in Washington. I think he had a lot of energy. Next. I showed you that one already. Next. And there's Grandma Tessie, and that is her body posture. Very, like I said, always smiling, always pleasant, but a woman who went through some hard stuff. I mean, this was a young girl who got pregnant at 18 and had a marriage that didn't work and had four failed marriages and had breast cancer. She was one of the first people I knew to have breast cancer and, had a mastectomy and whatever. And yet she kept going. Next. And that was Daddy when he was young. Next. That's Aunt Lorraine, very, very 50s with the bouffant, And I call that Aunt Lorraine being pink and mink, And the thing about her, though she was this glamorous person, she's not at all stuck up, never gossiped, she was just a fun person. She enjoyed life for the short 31 years that she had it. Next. And there's a very demure sister. And so like at Christmas time, we come down. The adults will go all out with, lavishing for Christmas. We'd have a fantastic breakfast and a fantastic meal. But later in the evening, the adults would play bid whist. A card table might be pulled out. Those who drank. Think Aunt Lorraine, think Uncle Mickey. Those who didn't, teetotalers, think Uncle Yellow, think Uncle Walter didn't. But everybody, I played with, my paper dolls on the floor, depending on whether the adults were running the stereo or my sister and I, you either heard jazz or you heard soul. But everybody was happy. And the wood stove was going. And it was too darn hot to be in there. But everybody was happy, especially if you happen to get something like a beautiful snowfall, Christmas evening, Aunt Lorraine would play the piano or afternoon, and Mom would sing. And they'd sing songs like, you won't know them, but like the poem Trees. I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. Mom would sing that, or a song He, and they certainly weren't Christmas songs, but they were worshipful. And what better place to celebrate trees than in Louisa? And I think that to this day, that's why trees remind me of women, and Black women in particular. Trees just remind me of women, Black women. Next. And so here's some of the pomp and circumstance. There, the gilded walls. And as much as when I was little, I thought, how tacky. When I bought my first house, I thought, golly, I wish I had those tiles. And they were just little tiles. But anyway, and of course, Thanksgiving. Well, actually, my mom was the queen of setting tables. And the neat thing is that we come down and the women would kind of trade off their talents. Like I told you, Tessie was not a domestic goddess. She was more likely to, drive a school bus or do any other little thing. But she enjoys the finery. Next. And there, well, okay. I had all kinds of computer issues, and so things are scrambled. You've seen that before. Next. Okay, that's why we were being redundant. Next. Okay, and these are the central places, the main places that I think serve to inform me. And they are simple spaces, the little place where Uncle Gillis lived, County Line Church, which is where I first got baptized. I was sitting there. We come down for third Sunday, which was revival time. The doors of the church were opened and people were going forward. And I asked my grandmother what that meant. And she said they're going forward because they believe Jesus died for their sins. And I said, well, everybody knows that. So I went in the aisle and my sister went in the aisle. And I thought everybody's going to think I went because Donna went, And so we got baptized. We came down a couple of weeks later and got baptized. And John Patrick Timberlake, my great-grandfather, told us from then on, we couldn't dance rock and roll. And being his great-grandchildren, we went in the house and put Wilson Pickett on and Boogaloo down Broadway. Next. And that's supposed to look like water, but that was to represent that I have been baptized at County Line for the first time. Next.
That's all we've got, Linda.
Okay, all right. I thought
You're good.
because I had, and I apologize to the audience. I've had untold computer issues, but anyway. But I hope that some of what I said is familiar to some of you, and I think that they're universal things, and I think that's why we can all say that we stand on common ground. And you will go from what the value is. What the value that I've gotten is that I know that you can go from cesspot to outhouse to gilded walls, but that shouldn't mean anything about who you are in this world, who you are to other people, how you approach other people. You know, Nanny Burden, who a street is named after, was John Patrick's first cousin. And Nanny Burden used to walk every day from Nanny Burden to the town of Louisa. And we'd see her going in the morning. And my aunt would say, Mama, there go Cousin Nanny. And you'd see her coming back in the evening. And there were people who speculated that Nanny Burden was a conjure woman or whatever. I think Nanny Burden was just progressive. She knew the value of health and herbal living. And by golly, and I think she lived to be pretty old. And now, and we were so proud when Nanny Burden Road was named after her. Of course, we were proud when Louisa went from having clay roads to asphalt, or clay roads to gravel to asphalt. We were like, Louisa's coming up. Go ahead. You know, Grandma Tessie isn't Route something post office box. She's got a street name. She lives on White Cell Avenue. And we teased and joked, but we're proud of Louisa. And so I'm not native born, but I consider myself, if not a native daughter, a native granddaughter. Are there any questions?
Yeah. Linda, I just want to ask this question about your father selling insurance.
Mm-hmm.
Was the insurance company part of a chain like Southern Aid Insurance, which was quite popular in Virginia?
I have no idea. He was a teenager. He graduated from school, from high school at 15 or 16.
Mm-hmm.
And he was selling insurance in high school.
Okay.
But I don't know. It probably was. I'm sure it was probably.
Yeah, because they had offices in all around DC, Norfolk, Richmond,
Tell me the
Roanoke,
name again. I'm
and
going
it
to
was
write it down.
that, yeah, Southern Aid Insurance. So
Southern Aid. Okay.
yes.
Was it
And
Black owned?
yes.
Aha.
And many had burial companies, burial programs,
Mm-hmm.
burial societies. So it may have been insurance sold from that entity as well. But we
That's
want
it.
to open it up for questions from the audience. I just was curious. I mean, Linda, thank you for sharing so much. In my mind, I was reflecting on my memories and growing up in a small community with my grandparents, because I ended up having to live with them for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And so much came up, and you just described it so wonderfully, all the experiences, many of the experiences. And I think, as you say, it's a connector for
Well,
conversation, for just the core of human experiences. Thank you so much.
I took it for granted when I was growing up. In fact, I didn't think a lot of this stuff was important, but then now I've come to appreciate it, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Any
Yeah. So
questions?
if anyone, has any questions, I think the really interesting thing here, Linda, is my grandfather grew up in Center City, Philadelphia, and used an outhouse because they were not wealthy at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then went on to, and I love the photos of the cars because the exact same cars.
Mm-hmm.
He had a rust orange VW Beetle, and he had that 66 Mustang, and he waited for it, and it was a whole thing about, getting rid of it after he passed because it was the car that he special ordered and waited for.
Mm-hmm.
Even though that's a totally different time, place, everything about it is different, and yet these are very intrinsic things to people and how they grow up. So
Very American things across the board.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And like your dad, who I'm sure your dad didn't feel uppity because he had that Volkswagen. He felt proud he had worked
Yeah.
for it. He had waited for it, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Amazing. Well, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them. If not, we're glad that you joined us today. This is a really interesting presentation, and um, you know, I think we all benefit from it. So, all right. Well, it seems like we don't have any questions, but I just want to say thank you, and I'd actually like to reach out to you. One of the things that I don't know if Marilyn and Latika had mentioned, but we're trying to figure out ways that oral history can translate into bolstering the genealogical and
Mhm.
archival records in the
Mhm.
museum. And you have great archival materials. And even obviously, I don't want your personal family photos, but if you'd be willing to, work with us and help us with some of those resources, that would be great, especially because you are from this family that lots of people are connected to in the county. And I think it would be a great resource for us.
Well, thank
Um,
you. And you guys have been a great resource to me because I only started doing my family's genealogy a few years ago. And you guys have been the place that I've leaned. And in fact, today, what was difficult for me was that I wanted to talk about my Quarleses and my Timberlakes because that's a whole other thing, you know. But, one at a time.
yeah, exactly.
You
Well,
guys,
we're here.
you guys helped me to find Spencer.
Yeah.
I'd only heard about Cephas, but I found Spencer because you guys exist.
We're going to be doing more genealogy workshops this summer, and hopefully you can help give some insight. And when you find out more, we can document the other part of the family. So
Thank you.
just thank you so much. And Marilyn, I don't know if you want to give a preview. I put handout in the handout section. It's our Oral History Month events that you're welcome to download. Yeah.
I want to share that those of you that are listening, please share this conversation, but also know that the Louisa County Historical Society is a repository. And in that vein, it welcomes your input, your voices, your artifacts, your remembrance, mainly because we have people coming to us doing genealogical research and would like to know about those experiences and be able to connect with either people, places, or things. And when you share that, it goes into the future helping the other generations. So we welcome and remember louisacountyhistory.org. You can contact us, louisacountyhistory.org. And thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Have a great weekend.
Bye
Bye,
bye.
all.